Before discussing the future of global trade, I would like to have a short look back in history with you and start with this key figure. The above chart shows the value of global export at constant prices, global exports at constant prices. So we take the prices of exports at year 1913 and then just recalculate all the exports. As you can see, in the last 2 centuries, our world has experienced a tremendous growth, an exponential growth in global trade exports. Well, with well-known interruptions such as the world wars around here, the Great Depression, also the oil crisis. At first glance, this might seem rather unsurprising. First, we all know that the world has become more globalized. What might remain surprising is the extent to which global trade volumes have risen. Of course, this leaves us with the question, will this always continue? To be honest, I did not show you the complete chart. We already do know that trade figures or export figures have not remained growing that way. In the past years, there has been a halt in global exports. And please be aware that here, the effects of the pandemic is not even depicted. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our today's speakers in which direction global trade will head in times of protectionism, the corona pandemic, trade war between China and the US, as well as rising ecological concerns. So how will this chart continue? A second reason why you might think that this graph looks rather unsurprising, of course, the world's population has grown substantially over the same period, and with it did global trade, of course, quite obviously. So instead of looking just at total figures, we should rather have a look at relative numbers. Let's do this for some selected economies. As we can see, global trade growth has come to a halt in recent years also when we look at relative numbers, but we can also see growth in global trade numbers over the past 4 decades. What I even find more mesmerizing is the fact how export-oriented Switzerland is. The numbers actually look quite similar if we compare them not to GDP, not exports in comparison to GDP, but if we compare exports with gross value added. So I think it is wise to be aware of the global trade trends as an open, small economy, and also be aware of Switzerland's role within these global trends, or Switzerland's potential role within these global trends. And that's exactly what we are going to talk about today. So it is an honor for me to welcome Mr. Simon Evanet, Professor Simon Evanet, Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen, and afterwards to welcome Patrick Dümler, who is Senior Fellow and Head of Research, Open Switzerland at Avenir Suisse. As I said before, you can ask your questions using the chat function. We will have a Q&A session at 5:10, more or less, where we will take all your questions, and I hope we can all answer them. So I would like to come to the first part of today's webinar with the title Future of Global Trade, which will be held by Mr. Professor Simon Evanet. Simon Evanet is Professor of International Trade and Economic Development and also MBA Director at the University of St. Gallen. Mr. Evanet specializes in how governments tilt the commercial playing field in favor of local firms. At the start of the global financial crisis, he created the Global Trade Alert Initiative, which I'm sure he will also talk about today. The Global Trade Alert Initiative is the leading independent monitor of protectionism, and commercial policy choice based here at the University of St. Gallen. So something we kind of can be proud about, that this trade alert is based here in St. Gallen. Simon Evanet holds a PhD in economics from Yale University. He has taught at the Universities of Oxford, Michigan, and Rutgers. And in addition, Professor Evanet has served as a World Bank official twice, has been a non-resident senior fellow in the Economic Studies program of the Brookings Institution, and he has been a member of the UK Competition Commission. Mr. Evanet has written over 200 articles, book chapters, and volumes, and so we can frankly say we will now hear from one of the world's leading trade experts about the future of global trade. Mr. Evanet, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Let me raise some slides and be able to hopefully share some material with you. I think this is not going to be the right slide. No. Let me just pull up what I hope is the right slide now. No. For some reason, I am not being able to access my own slides. I wonder, Mr. Riss, if you could raise the slides I sent to you earlier and we can talk them through that way.
I will do that.
For some reason, my computer wants me to open up some slides for teaching economics next year, and I don't think that's of interest to your audience. They've probably had enough economics in their careers. Right, let's get going. My job today is to take you through some global trade dynamics, okay? And can you see that on your slide or on the slides or not? Yeah, very good. All right. Now, if you can please advance one slide, I will get going. Excellent. Right, what I'd like to do now is to focus my presentation on the unilateral changes that governments have made to their trade policies. So much of the discussion in Switzerland in the newspaper is about free trade agreements which Switzerland has signed, but I want to argue that most of the action is actually in other areas where governments independently take action, either raising a tariff, putting in place a quota, offering a subsidy, and these dynamics have accelerated with the onset of the pandemic. Now, these unilateral policy changes are the types of thing that we track at the Global Trade Alert. And these are, if you want to think of it in commercial terms, this is policy intelligence, which reveals something about market opportunities which are created by foreign trade reforms. It also helps us understand what policies abroad are undermining the competitiveness of Swiss firms when they export. We can also better assess market disruptions, as well as having a more realistic assessment of the prospects of Swiss exporters in our foreign market over time. And this information is exactly what I want to proceed with. So, Mr. Riss, if we could go to the second slide of mine, that would be great. Right, let's discuss now the dynamics during the pandemic. If we go to the next slide, please. In this first slide, I want to summarize the dynamics which I think we've all heard of, which is that there has been a lot of changes in the area of trade policy in medical goods. And we can see on the left-hand side a chart which shows in the dark blue the number of countries which have introduced trade reforms or reductions in import tariffs and alike on medical goods. And we can see that nearly 200 import reforms on medical goods were introduced in the second quarter of last year compared to the beginning of the last year. And these have been slowly phased out over time, but still, as of the end of March, there are 162 of those reforms still in effect. In contrast, we also have had export disruption through governments banning the exports of face masks, ventilators, and other medical equipment. And we saw around 130 or so of those export curbs put in place. This is shown by the light brown line on the left-hand panel. And these rose to prominence in the second quarter of last year, causing enormous disruption to supply chains. And over time, they have been phased out. Many of them were phased out at the end of the year, but still we have around 60 to 70 of these different measures, nearly 100 of these different measures, which are still in effect. The consequence of these import reforms and export bans is that we are likely to see a permanent change in the trade policy towards medical goods. And this is material that we document literally day by day at the high scale, and we put out monthly updates of the policies which have been undertaken by governments. And if you're interested in this information, then you should contact me and we will add you to the distribution list. This, of course, will be of particular interest to anyone in the medtech sector. On the right-hand panel, you can see the number of countries which have been involved in this protectionism and this trade reform, and you can see that there are about 20 to 30 countries which are still have put in place either export reforms, export curbs rather, or import tariff reductions. So overall, quite a lot of action in medical goods, and much of it not temporary. I think it will be permanent. Let's move on to the next slide, please. We move then from the sectoral to the global, and what we have here in this particular chart is a summary of all of the policy interventions globally that have affected Switzerland's commercial interests. And what we can see is that if you look on the left-hand side, most of the trade distortions facing Swiss exporters since the beginning of the pandemic and Swiss overseas investors relate to subsidies. So these are foreign rivals who have been either bailed out or have received some type of financial support. That accounts for half of the trade distortions which have been faced. Another 20% of trade distortions faced are when Swiss firms compete against foreign firms in overseas markets where the foreign firms have received a subsidy to try and win orders. So this is a second important trade distortion. Overall, there are about 3 times as many harmful trade policies abroad affecting Swiss exports compared to liberalizing ones. But on the right-hand side, we can see there have been policy interventions over the last 15 months which have benefited Swiss exporters, and half of them again are tariff cuts. The other, another 15% are due to reductions in import quotas and non-automatic licenses. So essentially the news is not all bad. There is some good news, and but I'm afraid the good news is outweighed by the bad news overall. So globally, these are the developments that we have seen. Let's turn then next to the global trade volumes changes that we've observed. And this data was released by the World Trade Organization last week. And we can see that their latest forecasts, which are in yellow, point to even faster world trade growth in 2021 and a slowdown in 2022. In effect, what we're seeing in 2021 is a bounce back from the reductions we observed in 2020 with the pandemic. And if the World Trade Organization is right, then we should end this year with world trade higher than what it was at the beginning of 2020. So we will have fully recovered the losses from last year. Now, of course, many things can go wrong between now and the end of the year, not least of which is perhaps a slowdown or disappointment in the rates of vaccination, which of course could cause the national incomes of countries to recover more slowly. So one needs to be careful about these assumptions, but the omens are looking better and better over time, and this may well lead to some opportunities for Swiss firms to regain market share, or possibly even to break into markets they haven't been able to get into before. So this is the global perspective on the developments that we've seen. Let's now turn to the developments as they relate to Switzerland. So if we can draw out now the pandemic era trade policy responses and the impact on Switzerland, I will show you some results from the Global Trade Alert on this slide here, number 8. What we have over here is the year-by-year evolution in the number of trade reforms, which are in green, which benefit Swiss exports and Swiss foreign investors, and the harmful interventions, which are in red. And if you compare the scales of the two axes, two charts, you'll see that there are many more harmful measures every year than there are liberalizing ones. And you'll see that for 2020, there was a spike in both the number of trade reforms and in the number of harmful policies which hurt Swiss commercial interests. And this is very much in line with the global pattern that we have seen as well. So overall, then, we have seen essentially the pattern facing Swiss exports follows the global pattern. More trade reforms last year, largely on account of liberalization in the medical goods sector, and more trade distortions, largely subsidies which are being affecting Swiss exports. And so this gives you an indication of the number of times Swiss commercial interests have been hit. Of course, what we can do next is look at the scale of the trade affected and see how this has changed over time. So if we could shift to slide 9, please. What we have on this particular chart is the build-up since 2008 in the share of Swiss exports that face either reforms abroad, that's in the dark green line, or that face protectionism abroad. And you can see that the build-up over time has become so severe that by the time we got to the middle of the last decade, around 80% of Swiss exports face at least one trade distortion in overseas markets, which were not there before the global financial crisis. And this build-up in protectionism has occurred despite Switzerland being a member of the WTO and despite the regional trading agreements that Switzerland has signed. And this highlights the importance of following unilateral commercial policy changes and not just focusing on the trade agreements that SECO and SECO signs with other countries. When we look at this chart, we also see, as far as the trend is concerned, that the share of Swiss exports facing protectionism is much larger than the share of Swiss exports benefiting from trade reforms. So the direction of travel is mainly in the wrong direction, towards less commercial prospects. And we can see that most of the damage done was done before President Trump became president. So although it's very fashionable to blame President Trump for wrecking the world trading system, as far as Swiss exports are concerned, the damage was done before Mr. Trump even stood in the White House, got into the White House. And that's a very important message because the world trading system has been in trouble for a long period of time. If we go to the next slide, I can give you a more granular breakdown of the changes which we've seen since the beginning of the corona pandemic. And since the beginning of last year, there have been 419 foreign actions or foreign policy changes which have hurt Swiss good exports. And these could be tariff increases, these could be subsidy increases and the like. And you can break down the impact on Swiss exports into the different categories of policy. This chart shows you that in the year 2020, around 6.5% of Swiss exports faced new trade distortions on top of what they had experienced before. So 6.5% of Swiss exports were adversely affected by protectionism last year. This is on top of course, the disruption to the world trading system that was created by other COVID-related factors. And of the 6.5%, half of the worsened conditions for Swiss exporters was created by tariff increases. The pattern this year is dramatically different. This year, we see over 30% of Swiss exports facing worse competitive conditions in foreign markets. And this is largely because the European Union has introduced a new set of subsidies for their firms in order to help them cover their climate change related costs. Now, the EU gives away to energy-intensive firms lots of free tradable permits. So these are permits which can be used to pay for the carbon charges. And these permits are permanent allocations, so they are subsidies. They go onto the balance sheets and financial statements of firms. And so as a result, they constitute a direct transfer from the state. And as you can see, a large part of the additional trade distortions faced this year by Swiss firms is due to the fact that their European rivals have received plenty of subsidies. And so this is a big increase, which is entirely subsidy driven. There's an important lesson here for those of you who follow the world trading system. Many people complain about the Chinese having lots of subsidies. Very few people realize just how many subsidies the European Union has, even outside of agriculture. And if I was to show you data for the United States, you would see a similar pattern too. So generally, subsidies are the biggest problem we've seen in world trade over the last 10 years. And that's very true of the barriers faced by Switzerland as well. So this is a breakdown which helps you understand what's at stake in terms of Swiss exposure to trade distortions in the past 15 months. Let's move on to the next slide, please, to the outlook. So what I want to do now is to just make a few observations. some Swiss-related, some more general. You can use our database, the Global Trade Alert, to identify when trade barriers abroad are being phased out in the next 12 months. And we can see in green that some are being phased out. But but some governments also announce that they're going to put in place new trade barriers, and they announce this and then implement them later. And we can see that there are 87 policies which will be implemented in the next year or so, which will hurt Swiss exports. And so this early warning system can then be used to plan strategic responses. To give you a concrete idea, if we can go on to the next slide, please. Then next year, the United States will remove its so-called safeguard tariffs on solar panels. And this is an item which Switzerland exports. And these tariffs, which are currently at 15%, will be removed next year in February 2022. And so since we know this will happen, Swiss exporters can plan their market re-entry strategy or their market expansion strategy accordingly. And so it's therefore possible to be able to track when there will be future threats to Swiss export interests in the various sectors which are in manufacturing and in goods exports. And we can also track when there are market opportunities as well. And there are some which are coming along, and they should be followed. And the last substantive slide I have, please, relates not to Switzerland, but to the EU and the US, both of whom have announced new trade policy strategies. The strategies that they have announced involve changes, and these changes are important. The EU trade policy is being subordinated to its climate change and economic recovery goals. That means that the EU is emphasizing much more subsidies to support the energy transition. We talked already about one set of subsidies, and these will have trade consequences. The EU is also emphasizing the need for foreign countries to live up to their obligations. So they will be much tougher on enforcing trade agreements. And the EU has said that they do not really want to negotiate new trade agreements, not in the near term. China is clearly the target of this strategy, but it's not clear what the EU is really trying to accomplish, whether it's trying to change China's economic policies or whether it's trying to protect Europe from China's economic policies. The last big change on the EU side worth noting is that essentially the EU has signaled that they are willing to wait 3 more years to fix the World Trade Organization. They will never leave the World Trade Organization, but they've made it very clear that they will negotiate outside the World Trade Organization if there is no progress in the next 3 years. As far as the Biden administration is concerned, they have adopted for the first time what is called a worker-centric trade policy. And as a result, they are not looking to negotiate any free trade agreements with other countries, and they're not looking to cut tariffs as part of sectoral deals, such as in medical goods. The US has taken a much stronger line with respect to China. Instead of President Trump's transactional approach, the United States is trying to create a coalition to pressure China to change. And it's very clear that US trade policy is heavily influenced by foreign policy now and geopolitical considerations, including human rights concerns. And so US policy is therefore likely to be more consistently critical of China. And I think we should expect trade tensions there, not necessarily trade wars, but increasing trade tensions all the same. Let me wrap up then with my last slide. And if we could move on to slide 15, please. I would say that there are 3 important takeaways here. First is, as I've shown you over time, the treatment of Swiss exporters abroad by foreign governments is getting worse and worse. Okay, the policies of foreign governments, whether it's tariff increases or subsidies, are making it harder to win contracts and to keep foreign market shares. Now, when it comes to what is the solution to this, to be honest, Bern does not have the tools nor the resources to be able to counter this foreign protectionism, and so surely the best way to fight back against this protectionism is to have a world-class value proposition for customers so that they keep coming back for Swiss products time and time again. Free trade agreements are very popular with many people, but they do very little to tackle the underlying problem of increased subsidies. And so that problem, I think, can only be tackled by having products and services which foreign customers will buy under all circumstances. In terms of the prospects going forward, you should expect that there will be more trade policy tensions between China and the United States, China and the United States and China and the European Union. And increasingly, all firms, Swiss firms, German firms, American firms, and alike, will be asked to choose where do they want to supply. Do they want to supply China or the United States? This is an uncomfortable choice for many firms, but realistically, that's the choice we face here, as increasingly the Chinese and the Americans are setting themselves up for what is called decoupling, and that is reducing the dependence on each other for technologies, goods, services, and commodities. And this prospect, I think, will build over time. Thank you very much, and I turn it back to Mr. Riss.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evenet. Some really interesting insights. I am quite sure that there will be some questions regarding these information you provided about global trade. Also some information on Switzerland's role already. If you have any questions, as I said, please just post them in the chat function. I would like to hand over now to Patrick Dümlo, who will focus even more on the role of Switzerland within these global trade trends. Patrick Dümlo is Senior Fellow and Head of Research Open Switzerland at Avenir Suisse. He is responsible for topics such as free trade, farming, and also energy. Patrick Dümlo holds a master's degree in economics of the University of Zurich and a PhD from ETH Zurich, and published several textbooks. After more than 10 years as a strategy advisor and as head of an association which promotes medical technology exports, he joined Avenir Suisse in November 2015 and has since then focused on, as I said, among other topics, trade. So, Mr. Dümlo, I am very much looking forward to hearing from you about Switzerland's role within these trends of global trade, within this future of global trade. The floor is yours, Mr. Dümlo.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Mr. Riess. I'll try to share my slides with you. Let me see if that works. Okay, can you see my slides?
Perfect,
All
Mr.
right.
Dümlo, thank you.
Fine, good. So I'll focus a little bit more on Switzerland. What we observe at Avenir Suisse is, first of all, that of course Switzerland is highly connected trade-wise, but we still have significant free trade gaps that are remaining. And we have a bilateral path with the European Union that is facing challenges. So these are the two main issues I'll talk about just in the following. First of all, well, Switzerland first. If we are thinking about COVID-19, we heard from Professor Evenet, there were some import facilitation also that the Swiss government took, and we had border closures. There was no more free exchange of people between the European states. But even before the pandemic, we saw, for example, that Lex Kohler was enlarged to the energy sector. We had planned, or we still plan, an introduction of investment controls in Switzerland. And we still have the world's most complex tariff structure. And there is a question about the unilateral abolition of tariffs, which is still pending in Parliament, but which would be, of course, a step forward in furthermore opening up Switzerland for trade. If we look on the dependency of the Swiss GDP on overall trade, we see the following in comparison with some other countries that are depicted here on the slide. In red, we see the total trade volume, that's goods and services, in a percentage of GDP. That in Switzerland, we see import and exports together. They are almost 120% of our GDP are reflected by imports and exports. For example, if we compare that with China, we see that China has a little bit less than 40% of GDP reflected by international trade, even less the US. Let's look at the black dots that are here on the slides. That's the absolute trade volume in US dollars in billion. Here you can see, of course, Switzerland has quite a substantial trade volume globally, but of course in China and the US, trade volumes in absolute numbers are much higher, but they are less in relative terms compared to GDP. So we see that Switzerland's dependence on trade is higher compared to China and the US. And we also would conclude from that trade restrictions would have a higher impact on Switzerland's GDP than on most other countries, especially the large ones. Switzerland is also a champion of globalization, so we benefit quite substantially from globalization. If we look at the globalization index, there are several globalization indexes around. I took here one from the Bertelsmann Foundation. We see Switzerland is the fourth most globalized country in the world. If we look how these countries can turn globalization into additional income, we see that Switzerland is first. So we're really a champion of globalization. We can turn globalization into income increase. Well, foreign trade is also an engine for employment in Switzerland. On the left bar, you see the situation in 2002. In red, we have the employment in the sector which is oriented towards Switzerland, and grayish, you see all the employment that is export related. Dark gray, the employment that is export related towards the European Union, and light gray, all the rest. And the second bar on the right, that's the situation in 2019. And what we can see is that we have an increase in employment with the EU, or export-oriented employment with the EU by 24%. We see even more growth in employment, export-oriented employment towards the world, that's 68%, and inward-oriented employment that increased also, but only 14%. So we see that inward-oriented employment is the least, or is having a minor growth, whereas export-oriented employment has grown much, much more. Overall, we estimate that around 1.9 million employees benefit directly from exports. Indirectly, it's likely to be around 50% of all employees in Switzerland. Well, the Swiss economy also benefits from foreign investment. On the left, you can see the picture of a study that we did in 2018. And I would like to share with you the conclusions of that study. Of course, industries must be open for foreign investments in Switzerland. These industries that are most open for foreign investments have triggered the biggest growth impulses in the last 20 years in Switzerland. Foreign investment strengthens the economy's resilience. That's especially true for Switzerland. But what we require in the future is a level playing field regarding investment conditions. In our opinion, this is best achieved through multilateral cooperation. We were talking about China before. Professor Everett mentioned China and the US. Of course, also in Switzerland, there is a kind of a fear of China. We also looked at that in the study that I mentioned in the slide just before. There is a fear of China's takeover of Swiss firms, and this has increased the demand for investment controls, as I said in my introduction. If you look at some numbers here, we had the number here for 2016, the capital stock. We see that the capital stock held by companies controlled out of Asia, Africa, or Oceania was amounting to 23 billion Swiss francs, which is roughly 2.3% only of total capital stock held by foreign corporations. The China's share here was even too small to be mentioned separately in the statistics. We had between 2014 and 2017, 20 acquisitions of Swiss companies by Chinese investors. And we had on the other side, 11 acquisitions of Swiss investors by Swiss investors of Chinese companies. Of course, in relation to the global dominance of the Chinese economy, this is much, much more. So Switzerland, according to the size of the Swiss economy, has bought more Chinese firms than the other way round. We were talking about the free trade agreement before. Professor Evanet mentioned, of course, unilateral liberalization or trade restrictions have a dominant role in international trade, but of course, free trade agreements still play a role. Here we see the network of Swiss free trade agreement globally. We see in green current free trade agreements in place, and in blue free trade agreements that are under negotiation. If we look at the kind of the gaps in the network of Swiss free trade FTA network, we see that, of course, the most important gap in our free trade agreement network are the US. The US are a major trading partner of Switzerland. A little bit more than 60 billion Swiss francs goods and services are traded between Switzerland and the US each year, and they account for more than 10% of our overall trade. If you look a little bit deeper into that, we see the situation here, the exchange of goods, services, and FDI between the two countries. And we made an estimation that currently we have around 135,000 jobs secured in the US and 175,000 jobs in Switzerland by the export of goods. Also, foreign direct investments play a major role. You can see the number on the slides. And if we look at the potential free trade agreement, we see that could create in both countries even more jobs. But of course, currently there are no formal negotiations between the two countries, although in our opinion, this would be a big opportunity. Ongoing issue, my second point today is of course our relation to the European Union. The European Union still accounts for around 50% of total trade that Switzerland has. Second is the US that I mentioned before, and third, China. Well, foreign trade, it's really the neighbors. If we look a little bit deeper into that, with whom we trade, we see it's not so much Germany as a country, or the whole country, I should say. It's a state of Baden-Württemberg, for example. We compared here some numbers. So total trade of Switzerland with the state of Baden-Württemberg is even higher than total trade with China. And you can see a lot of other comparisons here. So it's really the closest neighbors. It's not only the countries which are close to us, it's the closest regions within these countries which are most important for Swiss trade. Trade, well, looking at the political weight of the EU for Switzerland, I said that before, it's around 50%. If we look on the opposite side, the weight that Switzerland has in the portfolio of global trade for the European Union, we see it's only around 7%. So there is an imbalance, also an imbalance if we take into account the relation of the GDPs between Switzerland and the European Union. When Switzerland concluded the free trade agreement with the EU in 1972, the total GDP of the EU 15 at that time was about 8.5 times bigger than the GDP of Switzerland. GDP here would reflect, of course, also the attractiveness of the market for the foreign partner. Well, if we look at the situation here more recently, here still number from EU 28, we see that the GDP was 25.5 times bigger than the GDP of Switzerland. So Switzerland actually is increasingly less important for the European Union when it comes to global trade. A conclusion, Well, first of all, the official conclusion, the federal report on the foreign trade strategy for 2028. Well, what does this report say? Well, the Swiss export economy should move back into the center of Switzerland's foreign policy. Yes, I believe that's quite true. That should be more important. They also conclude we should have an increased export promotion. As yet, there is no holistic approach or branding. Well, one might, of course, debate that. And third, they conclude Swiss firms should participate more in the activities of international corporations, especially to achieve the SDGs. Well, of course, the SDGs, that's also on the political agenda. And of course, the federal government expects companies to support also the SDGs. What is our suggested approach? Well, we have 3 pillars. First pillar is worldwide. We believe Switzerland should conclude new FTAs, complete the network of FTAs worldwide, and update existing FTAs. We shouldn't forget about these updates, which are also very important to facilitate trade. And of course, Switzerland should still actively work in strengthening multilateral cooperation. Professor Evenet mentioned it before, the World Trade Organization is not in good shape for the last few years that we could observe. So it's about intensifying cooperation with trading partners in this first pillar. Second pillar, it's about Europe. It's about securing and developing relations with the European Union. That, of course, is preservation of the bilateral treaties 1 and 2, but also the further development of the bilateral agreements. We're thinking about here about the framework agreement. And third pillar is, of course, competition. We should have a competition-oriented domestic policy. That means liberalization of the domestic economy, especially services and the agricultural market. I will finish here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dümler, for providing some insights on Switzerland's trade policy. As some of you might remember, we had Federal Counsel Ignacio Cassis as a guest at the Pfalzkeller in St. Gallen. A bit more than a year ago, he also provided information on this strategy 2028, Switzerland's foreign trade strategy, which is called Avis 28. So I would like to switch over to the Q&A part now. I've seen that we already have a question in the chat from Felix Appli regarding Switzerland's role with China. Before we head to this question, I would like to point towards a similar question, Mr. Evenet. Just a few days ago or a few weeks ago, the Swiss Federal Council or the Foreign Department or the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, excuse me, presented its strategy on how to deal with China. It's China strategy, it's China trade strategy as well. Before you mentioned that firms, enterprises have to decide on which side they want to be, on the Western side or on the Chinese side. More and more, they face this choice, or this, how do you say, they need to choose which side more and more often. How about whole economies? How about countries? How about Switzerland specifically? Is there also more and more a need to choose sides between Western countries and China, and how to choose wisely?
Thank you for that question. Let me expand my remarks so that I'm not misunderstood. I think for some firms, especially ones dealing with very advanced sensitive technologies, they will be asked essentially to choose between the Chinese market and the American market. That's the choice which is on the table, not are you on China's side or the West side? I think that is essentially the pressure which many firms in the most sensitive sectors are. If a firm is selling much less sensitive products, exporting them or producing them in China, I see much less of a problem. I suspect Nestle will not come under so much pressure. They are not selling anything which is particularly sensitive from a technological or military point of view. So I think it depends very much on what lines of business there are. It's any product or service, or in particular any good, which has a potential dual use or is linked to advanced artificial intelligence or IT, is likely to be one which is going to be regulated more and more aggressively by the United States. And the US is putting in place rules which essentially ban firms from supplying certain Chinese firms. So Huawei, it cannot be supplied with certain key pieces of equipment or IT from US firms anymore. And that ban also, by the way, applies to all foreign firms who supply Huawei as well. So the tensions are very much in the sensitive technological sectors, the advanced artificial intelligence sectors and the like. And I think their firms will face a very uncomfortable choice between supplying in the US market and in the Chinese market. And I must say, having whenever I've talked to board members in the German-speaking world, no one wants to choose, and I can understand why. Why not try and sell to both? But if they do choose, I'm surprised by the number who would say they would choose the Chinese market, because they see that as having bigger growth prospects over the longer term. So I fear the Americans may be a little bit surprised by the corporate response if they do push this matter too far. So that's how I see this issue breaking down.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evenet. Regarding the same question, Mr. Dümlo, the Swiss Federal Council has not chosen side with its Chinese strategy. It has, however, chosen rather clear statements against China. Is this kind of the future of how to deal with these tensions?
Well, it's a good question. I believe the strategy that was published is basically, in my opinion, still modeling through. As in many other policy areas, Switzerland probably tries to be below the radar of bigger countries and just do business with both sides. But still, it was quite remarkable, in my opinion, that the strategy wasn't against China or for the US or anything, but still we saw quite a harsh reaction of the ambassador, of the Chinese ambassador to Switzerland. I mean, if you followed his interview or the Q&A that he hosted, that was quite a reaction in my opinion. And I believe Switzerland will also increasingly face the question, and I agree with Professor Evenet, especially for sensitive technologies, to whom to deliver, who is our partner. And I believe still many CEOs of companies, bigger companies who provide such critical technologies are still uncertain, of course, what to do strategy-wise. And again, I believe also here it's still modeling through as long as it is, we do not face direct sanctions by either the US or China.
Thank you very much for answering this question, Mr. Dümlo. I would like to read Felix Epplis' question, which is also related to what you just said. Felix Eppli wants to know what effect the free trade agreement between Switzerland and China will have in the coming years. The question is addressed towards Mr. Evenet.
So I would say two things here. To the extent that there are still tariffs to be reduced on the Chinese side, then of course those tariff cuts will be implemented. I mean, if I remember rightly, the Chinese side phased in their tariff cuts over a relatively long period of time, and those benefits will still be there for the sectors where the tariff cutting is substantial. to the extent that the trade agreement relates to things like difficulties in customs houses and like here, although the Chinese are supposed to collaborate a lot more, I think very much that Swiss firms will remain at the mercy of the Chinese border guards and the Chinese customs officials. So this agreement may help a little bit at the margins, but it's not transformative. So I think the impact of this trade agreement is probably positive, but maybe not as great as some people had argued it would be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evenet. So Markus Wellstein, you have a question. Please just unmute your microphone.
Perfect. Can you hear me? Great. Hi, Simon.
Hi.
Good to see you again. Mr. Dimmler, I have a question regarding the slide you've shown, you know, with the Switzerland GDP, European GDP, EU 15 and then EU 28. You said it's increasingly important. As far as I, read the data, it has been increasingly important due to the fact that the European Union increasingly got new members, right? The GDP just grew by new members. My question is, if you look at the global setup of countries with the GDP growth, if that is the main criteria where you face or where you put your energy on in terms of free trade agreements, I would rather go to other countries, other continents, Asian countries such as Bangladesh, Indonesia. We just got it, right? The European Union has some countries in it that actually have negative growth or are really struggling. How do you see that from the Avenir Suisse? Is it really still a pillar that we should enlarge and that we should strengthen, that we should spend a lot of resources on, or should we rather go to some other countries?
Well, we actually should do both, in my opinion. Of course, each company has to decide themselves which are the core markets to serve, absolutely. But overall, looking at the whole Swiss economy, I mean, if we still have 50% with one trading partner, we better are on good terms with that trading partner. Otherwise, this will have a direct effect on our income.
Thank you very much. A more general question, not only regarding Switzerland, but the future of global trade. I would say the World Trading Organization has been blocked for years, mainly because of the US policy, which does not want to re-elect judges in arbitration boards. The question posed by Markus Benziger is, do you expect revitalization of the World Trade Organization thanks to the newly elected director Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala? Maybe Mr. Evenet, what do you think? Will WTO, maybe not only because of the re-election, but also, or not only because of the election of the new director, but also because of the election of Joe Biden, have a future? What role will the World Trade Organization play in future years?
So I think I hope that we are past the worst of this. For sure, the WTO has been in very bad shape for the last few years. There clearly is a desire on the part of the new Director General to turn things around. There are clearly groups of WTO members who want to see this happen. The question still remains whether the big players can cooperate with each other through the WTO. This is where your point about Mr. Biden comes in. The Americans have signaled that they are, that they do not want to have the same confrontational approach of Donald Trump, but at the same time, for them, trade agreements at the WTO are not really a priority. And when it comes to the issue of fixing the appellate's body or the judicial system at the WTO, the Americans have made it very clear that that will not happen unless some of their fundamental demands are taken account of. And the rest of the world at the moment does not appear to be too willing to give in to the Americans on this. That may well change too. So we have an administration in Washington that wants to go in a different direction. But ultimately, when it articulates what it would like to see happen at the WTO, it's hard to see how we will move that far beyond where things were under under Mr. Trump. And if that's the case, that would be a tragedy. I think we do have a Director General there at the WTO who is keen to try new things, who's open to new ideas. Much will depend on the extent to which she is prepared to take her case to prime ministers and presidents, and whether they will be willing to listen to her, because their prime ministers and presidents have got used to sidestepping and ignoring the WTO for over a decade. And so it will be interesting to see if they're prepared to take a different view. Maybe the pandemic will change their minds if there's a realization that with all these cross-border supply chains, countries have to find a way to cooperate with each other. And finding a way to cooperate with each other doesn't mean you have to like each other. You just have to find ways in which you can trust each other or stop distrusting each other. And I think that's maybe the gray area in which we have to operate.
And if I could add just a few sentences to that, in my opinion, of course, the WTO needs some internal reforms. Some of the processes are not designed for that large number of members, quite clearly. So it needs internal reforms. On the other side, what we see is, of course, that more and more countries are concluding bilateral or plurilateral trade agreements in order to probably counterbalance the weakness of the World Trade Organization. And there, coming back to what Mr. Wellstein said, there I believe Switzerland needs to very closely follow what other countries are doing in order to not basically fall behind. Currently, we have a very dense network of free trade agreements, but I believe we should observe how this is developing in other parts of the world, and probably also think about joining those.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evenet and Mr. Dümler. I think we come to an end. I would like to sum up what we heard in this hour. If you have more questions, Mr. Dümler, maybe also Mr. Evenet will remain in this room for another 5 to 10 minutes. So I would like to sum up. We have heard from Mr. Evenet that not only Switzerland, but also the world faces more harmful measures than liberalizing measures, with a peak in new measures last year. That there will be a bounce back in 2021, and that trade volumes, global trade volumes, will even be higher at the end of 2021 than at the beginning of 2020. Of course, there are some uncertainties, especially coming from the rate of vaccinations. I guess how fast we get vaccinated at a higher rate. Mr. Evenet said that around 80% of Swiss exports face at least one harmful measures, and if we look into the future, what will be relevant if we look around are the new trade strategies of the EU and of the US as well. What Mr. Evenet also said is that foreign trade agreements can help, but do little to tackle the growing problem of subsidies. We then looked specifically at Switzerland. Mr. Dümler from Avenir Suisse said that even before the corona pandemic, there have been new trade restrictions, and that Switzerland has the world's most complex tariff structure. Nonetheless, Switzerland is a champion of globalization, and foreign trade is an engine of employment. If we look at employment numbers of Switzerland, Mr. Dümler said that around 1.9 million employees benefit directly from exports, and around 50% benefit indirectly from exports. So in order to remain globalization champion, Mr. Dümler pointed towards 3 pillars where our focus should lie on. Worldwide, it is an intensifying cooperation with trading partners. If we look at our most important trading partner, which is obviously Europe, he said that we should secure and develop the relations with the EU, and on the domestic focus, we should have a competition-oriented domestic policy. So this is more or less the summary of our today's webinar. Mr. Evenet, Mr. Dümler, thank you very much for these very valuable insights that you provided us with on global trade, also on Switzerland's perspective of the future of trade. I would like to point towards our next events. At the end of April, we have another event that is part of this series of events, IHK Business Outlook Dialog. Welches Verhältnis wollen wir mit unseren Nachbarn? Then in German, together with Professor Christoph Frey, also from University of St. Gallen, and Professor Matthias Oesch. The focus then will be on the institutionelles Rahmenabkommen mit der EU, of course. Then on May 17th, we have the ECO St. Gallen Symposium, an event that we organized together with the internationally renowned St. Gallen Symposium, where we want to celebrate this cross-generational dialogue with the title Vertrauen in Zeiten der Unsicherheit. Among others, Federal Counsel Simonetta Sommaruga will hold a keynote speech remotely from the Bundeshaus. But there will also be these tandems with Unternehmerinnen, Unternehmern und Studentinnen, Studenten. You can find more information on www.ihk.ch/Veranstaltungen. Of course, we will also keep you informed with our newsletters. Mr. Dümler, Mr. Evenet, thank you very much for providing insights today. I wish you a nice evening, and all the others of you, I hope to see you soon at an event of IHK. Ade miteinander, vielen herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much.
Vielen herzlichen Dank, Mr. Evenet. Herr Dümler, vielen herzlichen Dank, sehr gut gewesen, danke.